I teach a class in which we go over the different mediums of medical interpretation: in person, video, and over the phone interpretation. I really wanted to share with my class the process by which medical facilities get in-person interpretation services, not only because it's helpful to know where we fit into the process, but because it has personally helped me in being more empathetic with staff and patients alike, who sometimes complain about how convoluted the process can be, or at the very least, voice their frustration with the resulting miscommunications. So I've decided to make this video. I've become familiar with this process and many of its variations as a result of my time working in the administrative and scheduling side of healthcare facilities, as well as my experience working in a variety of settings and roles in the language services profession. That being said, this is not a one-size-fits-all explanation of the process by which healthcare facilities request in-person interpreters, but rather a general overview of a variety of processes that I am familiar with across different medical settings. I might explain a process here that a clinic or hospital doesn't use, or I might not cover the process that some hospitals and clinics go through. This is designed to give you a very general idea, if not just one example, of how this process can be confusing or complicated for those involved. So if a facility has staff interpreters, what they're going to do is typically, first off, what types of facilities typically have staff interpreters? Usually these are hospitals, or these are clinics with a very large percentage of their patient population being limited English proficient folks. However, not all hospitals have staff interpreters. In fact, in the area in which I live, there is, I believe, only one hospital system that really has a robust on-staff interpreter program of the 3 hospital systems in the area in which I live. So if a facility, let's say a hospital or a clinic, has staff interpreters, they're going to request an interpreter for their patient. Typically in a hospital, they're going to have like a language services department, and then a staff interpreter will be dispatched or sent to that location if they're available. Now, if they don't have a staff interpreter available, or if they just don't use staff interpreters, they may base how they request an interpreter on whether the patient is insured or not. So in this case, if the patient is insured, the facility is typically going to reach out to the insurance company. They might do this by calling, sending an email. They might even have to fax something to the insurance company to request an interpreter. And now, it is entirely possible that out there some insurance companies have staff interpreters that work directly for the insurance company. However, in my experience, both as an interpreter and as someone who's worked kind of in the administrative and scheduling end of clinics, by and large, I can tell you that insurance companies typically have contracts with with interpreting agencies if they're going to be providing in-person interpretation. And then after the insurance company reaches out to the interpreting agency to get the interpreter, the contract interpreter is going to be sent there to the facility on that date or on that time for that appointment. Now, if, again, they base it on whether the patient's insured or not, they will typically go through a different process if the patient is uninsured. So they will typically the facility will typically directly call an interpreting agency, or however they typically schedule interpreters for themselves. They'll go through that process to get a contract interpreter sent there. But sometimes medical facilities, they just don't want to go through the insurance to request interpreters. So in this case, if they don't go through the insurance company to request an interpreter, that means the facility is going to be on the hook for paying for interpretation services. But a lot of people are like, well, why would the facility opt to pay for something that the insurance could very well pay for? Because it's not the responsibility of the patient to pay for interpretation services. That's actually illegal. So there are a number of reasons why this happens, but one of the biggest reasons why facilities, and the reason I've personally experienced, having worked, again, in the administrative side of healthcare, is that requesting interpreters through an insurance company can sometimes be a lengthy, complicated process. Now, this really depends on the insurance company, among other factors, of course. Sometimes patients can and do request interpretation services through insurance if they're available, and the healthcare facility a lot of times doesn't even know that the patients requested an interpreter through the insurance company sometimes. So this is where we sometimes get two interpreters showing up on the same day for the same patient. Sometimes there are duplicate requests sent through the insurance company for an interpreter for the same appointment. Sometimes the facility has their own interpreter through a different agency, and then the insurance company sends an interpreter. But generally speaking, if the facility is going to request, most of the time, they have to get in contact with the insurance company. Now, they may need to do this each and every time they want to request, reschedule, cancel, or otherwise modify an appointment in any way that they need to have interpreted. Sometimes this involves calling, and sometimes being on hold for a while. Sometimes it involves faxing a form. Other times it involves just sending an email. In these cases, each change needs to be processed by the insurance company, and they have to communicate this to the interpreting agency they're using to get interpreters. Sometimes this can take hours, sometimes it can take a week, or 2, or 3. And then it's going to take the interpreting agency some time to get in touch with that particular interpreter to let them know about the changes and to confirm availability. This is why sometimes interpreters show up to interpret at healthcare facilities for appointments that have been canceled. The facility may have let the insurance company know a week before that it was canceled, but they never communicated it to the interpreting agency, or the interpreting agency just got notified about it and hasn't even had a chance to let the interpreter know. It can potentially be a really inefficient system that requires significant processing time, which obviously isn't ideal for last-minute appointments or schedule changes. Thankfully, some insurance companies and interpreting agencies have arrangements in which the medical facility can reach out directly to the interpreting agency, either initially, bypassing the insurance company altogether and leaving that work to get in contact with the insurance company up to the agency, or communicate any and all appointment changes after the initial appointment request to the interpreting agency. This is, in my experience as an interpreter and working in clinic admin, the most efficient process that results in the best interpreter coverage if you're requesting an interpreter through the insurance company. So sometimes facilities just don't go through the insurance company. Like I said, this highly depends upon the company and the interpreting agency they contract with, but sometimes it can be a really slow process that results in interpreters showing up at the wrong times or not showing up at all through no fault of their own. Nonetheless, we often get blamed. I've also witnessed insurance companies, in an effort to cut costs, try to enforce the use of remote interpretation in appointments, in which remote interpretation just really is not ideal. So the facility will just request an in-person interpreter by themselves, or, unfortunately, sometimes they might not even rely on the services of an interpreter. While it shouldn't happen, it does sometimes. I'm the first person to affirm that remote interpretation is an incredibly valuable service that really solves a lot of issues, especially in terms of availability and accessibility. But in some cases, it's just not going to be a suitable replacement for in-person interpretation. So medical facilities and insurance companies using it as a blanket service for all appointments, regardless of its suitability, is, in my personal and professional opinion, detrimental to patient outcomes and the trust in our profession as a whole. Placing remote interpreters in impossible situations is unjust and detrimental to all involved. I've also unfortunately borne witness to insurance companies contracting with interpreting agencies that can offer the lowest possible price for in-person interpreters. And I'm talking about lower than I've ever seen before. Healthcare facilities are able to tell the difference between qualified interpreters and unqualified interpreters, and may avoid requesting interpreters with insurance companies that utilize the services of interpreting agencies of ill repute to save money. It happens. Period. If the facility has exhausted all of its options for on-site interpreters and none are available, they should rely on remote interpretation or a qualified bilingual staff member who has the necessary knowledge and linguistic abilities to interpret. However, in many cases, and I've borne witness to this as well, unfortunately, facilities just don't utilize the services of an interpreter for patients with limited English proficiency, likely breaking the law, or they rely on a family member or friend, which, in many cases, is also in violation of federal law.